Ridgewood, Texas, August 28, 2023. Chris Whitman, a 35-year-old auto mechanic, was found dead inside his repair shop late at night. What initially seemed like a workplace accident quickly raised suspicions, prompting a deeper investigation. As detectives examined the circumstances surrounding his death, they uncovered inconsistencies that pointed to a deeper conflict, leading to a thorough investigation into the events that had unfolded. Sergeant Nolan Rogers stepped off the plane, his boots hitting American soil for the first time in 4 years. He scanned the crowd at the arrival gate, eyes adjusting to the bright Texas sun streaming through the airport windows. A cluster of people stood holding signs. "Welcome home, Danny," Ridgewood's own hero. But he was looking for just one face. Jenny stood near the front, her hands cradling the swell of her stomach. She was easy to spot, her blonde hair pulled into a loose ponytail, wearing the same simple gold necklace he had given her before deployment. The moment their eyes met, she smiled, wide but tense, as if she wasn't sure what to do next. Nolan didn't hesitate. He crossed the space between them, wrapping his arms around her, feeling the warmth of her body for the first time in years. She smelled like home, faint traces of vanilla and laundry detergent. She squeezed him hard, holding on longer than he expected. "God, I missed you," he muttered into her shoulder. She let out a shaky breath, then pulled back, wiping her eyes quickly. "Welcome home." The crowd clapped, voices overlapping in excitement. His mother stepped in next, gripping his face in both hands, inspecting him like she was making sure he was real. His father gave him a firm handshake, followed by a brief, awkward hug. A few old friends from high school patted him on the back, making comments about how he hadn't changed a bit, even though he knew that wasn't true. The town of Ridgewood had been waiting for this. A local boy, back from war, about to start a family. He could see it in their faces, the expectation, the relief. People wanted a story with a happy ending. The next few days were filled with welcome home gatherings. A barbecue at the town park, a church potluck, even a small event at the VFW where older veterans shook his hand and called him brother. Everyone had a story to tell, a question to ask. What was it like over there? Did you see combat? How does it feel to be home? Nolan gave short, polite answers, steering the conversation away from anything real. The truth wouldn't fit into casual conversation over potato salad and cold beer. Jenny stayed close through it all, but there was something in her posture that unsettled him. She was affectionate, but her smiles never quite reached her eyes. She touched his arm often, like she was reassuring herself he was real, but when he pulled her into an embrace, she felt stiff. He chalked it up to the pregnancy. She was 7 months along now, the weight of the baby shifting how she moved, how she carried herself. He had missed everything. Her morning sickness, her cravings, the first kicks. Maybe she was just tired. They settled back into the house together, the small brick home on Maple Street that they had bought right after their wedding. It felt smaller than he remembered. His things were still there, untouched since the day he left, but the space itself felt different. Jenny had redecorated, swapping out furniture, rearranging the bedroom. There were new dishes in the kitchen, a different brand of coffee in the pantry. Small things, but they made the house feel less like his. She had lived a whole life here without him. That fact settled uncomfortably in his gut. The first night back, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Jenny slept beside him, her breathing shallow and uneven. He had imagined this moment for months, being back in his own bed, feeling the quiet weight of her next to him. But now that he was here, something felt off. He pushed the thought aside. Adjusting takes time. That's what the transition counselors always said. Over the next few days, the unease grew. Jenny was careful with her words, choosing them deliberately in conversation. When he asked about the pregnancy, she kept her answers brief, shifting the focus back to him. "You must be exhausted," she said. "You don't have to worry about all this baby stuff yet. Just settle in." She spoke like she was protecting him from something, like his presence disrupted a rhythm she had grown used to. When they went into town, Nolan noticed people acting strangely. Not in obvious ways, but enough that it put him on edge. Some people, like the guys he used to work with at the auto shop, seemed eager to ask about his service but avoided talking about anything personal. Others, like the waitress at the diner they had eaten at for years, hesitated when asking about Ginny and the baby. It wasn't paranoia. He knew when people were holding something back. Then there were the comments about his brother. "Man, you should have seen Chris the past few years," an old friend said, laughing over drinks. "Acting like Ridgewood's golden boy, stepping up for your folks, helping Ginny out whenever she needed something." It was meant as a compliment, but something about it didn't sit right. Chris had always been the reckless one, the kid who couldn't hold a job, the one who coasted through life with a smile and a charm that let him get away with anything. The idea of him stepping up didn't fit. Nolan paid attention after that. Chris had been around a lot, that much was clear. He knew things about Ginny's pregnancy that Nolan hadn't been told. He talked about cravings she had early on, doctor's visits, little details that made Nolan feel even more like a stranger in his own life. When Nolan mentioned this to his mother, she brushed it off. He was just trying to help. We all were. Then she added, casually, Ginny had a rough time at the start. She was a mess when she found out she was pregnant. Nolan frowned. Why? His mother hesitated. Well, you weren't here. That answer didn't sit well with him. That night, lying in bed, he replayed the last few days in his mind. The way people spoke carefully around him. The way Ginny flinched slightly when he kissed her. The way Chris avoided direct eye contact when they talked about the past year. Nolan couldn't shake the feeling that people were avoiding certain details. Conversations ended a little too quickly. Eye contact shifted at the wrong moments. It wasn't just in Ginny, it was in everyone. The first few days after returning home, Nolan Rogers did his best to ignore the nagging feeling that something was off. He told himself it was just the adjustment period. He had been gone for 4 years. Most of his communication with Ginny reduced to emails and rushed phone calls on poor connections. It was only natural that things felt different. But as the days passed, the distance between them became harder to ignore. Ginny was affectionate in all the ways she was supposed to be. She held his hand in public, kissed him when people were watching, made sure to touch his arm when they spoke. But there was something rehearsed about it. It lacked the ease they had once shared. When they were alone, the physical closeness disappeared. She was quick to find excuses, exhaustion, pregnancy discomfort, headaches. At first, Nolan accepted it. He had read enough about pregnancy to know it could be draining. Still, small things kept gnawing at him. Ginny had always been the type to talk about everything. Her thoughts, her feelings, even the mundane details of her day. But now, she gave him just enough conversation to keep things moving without ever letting him in. He'd ask about doctor's visits, the baby's progress, how she had been managing alone. She answered in short, practice sentences before turning the topic back to him, asking about his deployment, his experiences. At first, he appreciated it. Most people didn't want to hear the real answers to those questions. They wanted the hero's version, the one wrapped neatly with patriotic sentiment. But Ginny wasn't most people. Or at least, she hadn't been. The house was another issue. Before he left, they had spent months decorating it together. Every piece of furniture, every framed picture had been a shared choice. But now, it looked like someone else's home. The living room had been rearranged. A new recliner sat where his old chair used to be. Their bedroom felt unfamiliar. New sheets, different curtains, even a different scent in the air. The small details told him what Ginny wouldn't say. She had built a life without him in it. But the first real warning sign came from outside the home. The town was small, the kind of place where nothing went unnoticed for long. People talked, at the diner, at the gas station, in the church parking lot after Sunday service. And in a place like Ridgewood, a soldier's homecoming was big news. At first, the comments were harmless. People welcomed him back, told him they were proud of him, asked about the baby. But then, certain remarks started standing out. "You must be so relieved," one woman at the grocery store said. "Ginny had a rough time without you." Nolan forced a smile. "Yeah, I imagine pregnancy isn't easy alone." The woman hesitated, as if deciding whether to continue. "Not just the pregnancy. Just everything." She trailed off, offering him a tight-lipped smile before walking away. At the barber shop, an old friend brought up Chris. "Your brother really stepped up while you were gone," he said. "Always making sure Ginny was taken care of. You're lucky to have him." Nolan nodded, but didn't respond. It wasn't the words themselves that unsettled him. It was the tone. It was the way people spoke about Chris and Ginny in the same breath, as if they were a pair. As if it had been Chris, not Nolan, who had been there for her. He tried to shake it off. Chris had always been good with people, the kind of guy who could talk his way out of anything, charm his way into anyone's good graces. It wasn't surprising that he had taken on a bigger role in the family while Nolan was away. His parents had probably needed the help. And Ginny, she had been alone for a long time. One night, over dinner at his parents' house, his mother made an offhand comment that stuck with him. You know, I don't think Ginny would have made it through those first few months without Chris. Nolan paused mid-bite. What do you mean? She gave him a knowing smile. Oh, you know. He was always checking in on her, running errands, making sure she wasn't lonely. He was a godsend. His father, silent up until that point, cleared his throat. Your mother's exaggerating, he said, his voice gruff. She did just fine. His mother waved a dismissive hand. Well, I thought it was sweet. I know how hard it must have been for her. Nolan forced himself to keep eating, pushing the conversation out of his mind. Later that night, lying in bed next to Ginny, he stared at the ceiling, replaying the words. I don't think Ginny would have made it through those first few months without Chris. The idea made his stomach turn, but he told himself it was nothing. His mother had always been dramatic, but as the weeks went on, dismissing the rumors became harder. At the hardware store, he overheard two men talking near the back aisle. She didn't waste any time moving on. She had to know it had come out eventually. Small town like this. They fell silent when they saw him. At the diner, an old neighbor of his parents asked how the baby was doing, then gave him a long, assessing look before adding, must be tough, coming back to all this. All what? Nolan started watching people more closely. The way conversations shifted when he walked into a room. The way some people looked at him with pity, while others avoided eye contact altogether. The worst part was Chris. His younger brother had always been relaxed around him, always quick with a joke, always walking through life like nothing could touch him. But now, he was different. He was careful, measured. He didn't make as much eye contact, didn't hang around as much as he used to. Whenever they were in the same room, he always seemed to have somewhere else to be. One night, Nolan was sitting in the backyard, nursing a beer, when Chris pulled into the driveway. He watched through the window as his brother stepped onto the porch, hesitating before knocking. Ginny answered. Chris leaned in, saying something Nolan couldn't hear. Ginny glanced toward the window before stepping outside, pulling the door closed behind her. Nolan sat still, gripping the bottle in his hand. He wasn't sure how long they talked, but when Chris left, Ginny came inside looking unsettled. She noticed him watching and forced a smile. That was just Chris, she said quickly. He was checking in. Nolan watched as Ginny moved through the kitchen, her back turned to him. The conversation with Chris was over, but something about the way she carried herself, stiff, careful, stuck with him. He took a sip of his beer and looked away. Nolan had spent years operating on instinct. It had kept him alive in combat, spotting patterns, recognizing when something was out of place. His mind processed inconsistencies before he was even aware of them. At home, those instincts should have faded, but something felt wrong. It started with a receipt. He had been looking for a spare truck key when his fingers brushed against a crumpled piece of paper in the back of the kitchen drawer. A restaurant receipt, dated 3 months ago, from Dallas. Ginny hadn't mentioned any trips out of town. 2 entrees, 2 drinks, dessert, paid in cash. Ginny never used cash. She used her debit card for everything, even small purchases. She wasn't careless with money, but she wasn't the type to hide transactions either. Cash payments left no trail. Nolan folded the receipt and slipped it into his wallet. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe she had gone with a friend. Maybe it was nothing. But he didn't throw it away. A few days later, his mother mentioned Ginny's pregnancy symptoms early on. She had been talking about how much she had helped Ginny while Nolan was deployed. She was a mess when she first found out. The morning sickness, the stress, it hit her hard, she said. Especially those first few weeks. I don't know how she got through it alone. Nolan tensed. When was this? Oh, I don't remember exactly. Right before she told us all, I suppose. Maybe mid-February? Jenny had told him she found out in March. His mother kept talking, unaware of the shift in his demeanor. I remember because I kept telling her she should see a doctor sooner, but she wanted to wait, probably afraid of doing it without you here. Mid-February. That was almost 6 weeks before Jenny had told him. If she had taken a pregnancy test in February, that meant conception had happened even earlier. Late December. That had been one of the worst stretches of his deployment. He and Jenny had barely spoken that month. Bad internet, long missions, days without contact. When they did talk, she had seemed distant. He had assumed it was stress. Now, he wasn't sure. Nolan didn't ask Jenny about it right away. He needed to be certain. Instead, he started paying attention. Jenny had always been open with him before, quick to share the details of her day, to tell him what was on her mind. Now, she controlled what she told him. When he asked how she was feeling, she kept her answers vague. When he brought up the baby, she smiled but never spoke in specifics. If he tried to press further, she changed the subject. The biggest change was her phone. Jenny had never been secretive with her messages before. She always left her phone sitting on the counter, never one to guard her notifications or rush to silence a ringing call. Now, she kept it with her constantly. When she did set it down, it was face down. One evening, while she was in the shower, Nolan reached for it. Locked. That was new. It wasn't proof of anything, but it confirmed one thing. She was keeping something from him. And he wasn't the only one who had noticed something off. At the barber shop, an old friend brought up Chris. Your brother really stepped up while you were gone, he said. Always making sure Jenny was taken care of. You're lucky to have him. Nolan forced a short laugh, but didn't respond. It wasn't the words themselves that unsettled him. It was the tone. The way people spoke about Chris and Jenny in the same breath, like they were a pair. Like it had been Chris, not Nolan, who had been there for her. His mother had said something similar. I don't think Jenny would have made it through those first few months without Chris. At the time, Nolan had brushed it off. Chris had always been good with people, always the one to step in when someone needed help. And Jenny had been alone for a long time. But then there was the way people looked at him when he walked into her room. At the hardware store, 2 men stopped talking when they saw him. At the diner, an old neighbor of his parents asked how the baby was doing, then gave him a long, assessing look before saying, must be tough, coming back to all this. All what? Nolan didn't have an answer. One night, past midnight, movement stirred him awake. Jenny was slipping out of bed, moving carefully, as if trying not to wake him. Nolan stayed still, breathing evenly, keeping his eyes half-lidded as she tiptoed toward the hallway. A few seconds later, he heard the soft click of the back door. Through the bedroom window, he saw her standing on the porch, phone pressed to her ear. Her free hand hovered over her stomach, fingers lightly grazing the fabric of her nightshirt. Her voice was quiet, but the stillness of the night carried sound easily. I just need more time, she murmured. I was going to tell him. You know that. Just not like this. Nolan's jaw tightened. She was silent for a few seconds, listening to the other person. Then, no, not now. I don't even know how to start. Another pause. Jenny closed her eyes, rubbing her forehead. I know, but he's already watching me. I can tell. Nolan lay motionless, staring at her through the window. He didn't hear the rest of the conversation. He didn't need to. He stayed awake for the rest of the night. Jenny slept soundly beside him, unaware that he hadn't moved in hours. His mind kept circling back to the same questions. Nolan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind kept circling back to the same details, the receipt, the phone, the way people talked about Chris. Each piece sat there, unsettled, refusing to fit together the way it should. He didn't move for the rest of the night. The phone call echoed in Nolan Rogers's mind, fragments of a conversation that suggested something was wrong. His suspicions had been building for weeks. 4 years of military service in the Army's 82nd Airborne Division, 4 years away from Ridgewood, Texas, and now everything felt different. The receipt he had found earlier nagged at him. A coffee shop bill from a location Chris frequently visited, dated 2 weeks before Nolan's return from deployment. His mother's comment about Jenny's pregnancy timeline added another layer of uncertainty. During a family dinner after his return, she had mentioned the due date, which didn't align with what Nolan had in mind. Nolan had spent years in environments where small inconsistencies could mean life or death. His training in intelligence and reconnaissance had conditioned him to analyze information, recognize patterns, and identify discrepancies. The hushed phone calls, Jenny's altered behavior, and Chris's presence in her life were factors he could no longer ignore. Ridgewood was a small town. People talked. Strangers hesitated before greeting him. Conversations at the diner trailed off when he entered. Nothing overt, but enough to raise concerns. He was not paranoid. He had learned to read behavior and situations accurately. The house now felt unfamiliar. Jenny's habits had changed. She moved differently, adjusted objects without purpose, and avoided direct eye contact. These were signs of someone keeping something hidden. Her schedule had changed subtly, with more unexplained errands and last-minute appointments. She spent time on her phone late at night, quickly putting it away when she noticed him watching. The passcode on her phone had changed, something she had never done before. Jenny returned home that evening. Nolan sat at the kitchen table, watching her move through the house. She busied herself unnecessarily, avoiding any direct interaction. The tension in the room was evident. He studied the way she took longer than usual to put away her belongings, how she kept her back turned to him more than usual. There was hesitation in her movements, as if she were waiting for him to speak first. Nolan reviewed what he had gathered. The phone calls, Chris's involvement during his deployment, the receipt, the pregnancy timeline. Each fact reinforced his doubts. He had noticed inconsistencies in Jenny's explanations before, but had given her the benefit of the doubt. Now, those inconsistencies stacked up against her. Jenny's response was immediate: denial. She dismissed his concerns, claiming misunderstandings and coincidences. Her explanations were smooth, but did not fully address the discrepancies. Her attempts to shift the focus onto other things were apparent. She brought up work, errands, and day-to-day concerns, as if addressing those would steer the conversation away from what he had uncovered. When that didn't work, she tried to turn the situation around, making it seem like Nolan was imagining things, like the stress of adjusting to civilian life was causing unnecessary suspicion. As he pressed further, inconsistencies emerged. Her words contradicted previous statements. Physical cues suggested discomfort. She finally admitted to an emotional mistake with Chris, but insisted the baby was Nolan's. The certainty in her voice felt rehearsed. He observed the way she held herself, how she kept her arms crossed, her fingers tapping against her sleeve. Small, nervous habits she had never displayed before. She maintained eye contact, but only for short bursts, looking away just as quickly. Nolan had spent years interrogating people. He knew when someone was withholding the truth. Jenny's statements did not eliminate his doubts. He relied on actions over words, and her actions confirmed his suspicions. His instincts told him there was more to the story than she was willing to admit. He had been trained to notice behavioral patterns, and Jenny's were telling. Every defensive response, every deflection, every moment of hesitation painted a clearer picture. A direct confrontation with Jenny would not yield more. Pressing further would be counterproductive. Instead, he would go to the source. If Jenny would not provide the full truth, Chris would. He needed to hear it from him directly, without the barriers of explanation or excuse. He needed a clear answer that didn't come wrapped in justifications or rehearsed responses. Nolan grabbed his truck keys and left. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a facade. The drive to Chris's place wasn't long, but with each passing mile, Nolan's certainty grew. He had all the pieces. Now, he needed confirmation. Chris's auto shop was still open when Nolan arrived. The fluorescent lights inside illuminated the work area, the smell of motor oil and metal thick in the air. Chris was alone, finishing up work on a vehicle. He didn't notice Nolan at first, too focused on tightening a bolt under the hood. Nolan stepped into the shop, the sound of his boots on the concrete catching Chris's attention. He looked up, startled for a brief moment before masking his reaction. Chris wiped his hands on a rag, leaning against the workbench as Nolan approached. The silence stretched between them. Chris's expression shifted slightly, something unspoken passing between them. Nolan's mind was already made up. This wasn't just about the receipt or the phone calls. This was about getting the truth from the one person who could no longer avoid it. Chris's posture changed as Nolan stopped in front of him. A shift in stance, a tense jaw. He didn't ask why Nolan was there. He already knew. That, in itself, was another answer Nolan didn't need to hear out loud. His brother had never been good at hiding things. He could be quiet when necessary, but his body language always betrayed him. The avoidance of eye contact, the tight grip on the rag in his hands, the way his shoulders squared slightly as if bracing for something. Nolan followed Chris's truck from a distance, keeping his speed steady, his grip on the steering wheel firm. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving only the fading glow of daylight to guide him along the familiar back roads. The route was predictable. Chris was heading to his workplace, the same auto shop he had worked at since high school. It was the only place open this late, the last stop before he went home. Nolan pulled into the lot a few minutes after Chris, parking a short distance away. He watched as Chris climbed out of his truck, stretching his shoulders before heading toward the shop's entrance. The overhead lights cast long shadows, illuminating the worn concrete and the vehicles lined up for repair. Nolan waited, scanning the lot, his thoughts methodical. He wasn't here to ask questions he already knew the answers to. He was here for confirmation. Chris disappeared inside, and Nolan followed. The shop smelled of oil and metal, the air thick with the scent of grease. A single fluorescent bulb flickered near the back, casting an uneven glow across the workspace. Chris stood near a tool chest, rummaging through a drawer, unaware of Nolan's presence until the heavy footsteps reached him. When he turned, his expression shifted, a brief flicker of recognition followed by guarded apprehension. Nolan stepped closer, closing the distance between them. Chris straightened, wiping his hands on a rag, his movements deliberate but tense. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the faint hum of a nearby air compressor. Chris's eyes darted to the side, as if calculating an exit, but there was nowhere to go. Nolan had already positioned himself between Chris and the only open path. The weight of the moment settled over the room. Nolan laid out what he knew, each statement direct and deliberate. Chris's presence in Jenny's life during his deployment, the late-night calls, the altered behavior, the inconsistencies, the baby, the receipt. Everything Nolan had uncovered led to one conclusion, and now it was time for Chris to say it out loud. Chris's reaction was expected. A moment of denial, a shake of the head, followed by an attempt to deflect. He said it wasn't like that things had been complicated, that Nolan didn't understand. But Nolan did understand. He had spent too much time piecing it together to be swayed by vague justifications. He pressed again, his words sharper this time, cutting through the excuses. Chris hesitated, his shoulders tensing under the weight of the confrontation. His gaze dropped to the floor, hands gripping the edge of the tool chest behind him. The pause lasted too long. Then, without meeting Nolan's eyes, he gave the answer that Nolan had already known but needed to hear. The baby wasn't his. Jenny had lied. The admission landed with finality, solidifying everything Nolan had suspected. There was no relief, no sense of closure, just a surge of something sharp and deep, a feeling he couldn't immediately place. His body reacted before his mind fully processed it. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his movements tense and deliberate. Chris coughed, lifting a hand in a weak attempt to defend himself, his voice rough as he muttered something about how he never wanted it to happen this way. The words barely registered. For a moment, everything hung in the balance. Nolan could have let his anger take over, could have pushed further, but something in his mind pulled him back. Chris wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his breathing uneven. He didn't try to justify himself anymore. There was nothing left to say. Nolan exhaled, stepping back, his pulse still pounding. He didn't feel better. There was no satisfaction, no sense of resolution. The betrayal still sat heavy, unchanged by the violence. The realization settled in slowly. Chris had confirmed the truth, but Jenny had been the one who had chosen to lie. She had been the one who had faced him day after day, knowing what she had done, and had still let him believe otherwise. The weight of that deception pressed harder than the confrontation with Chris had. The questions he had come here with had been answered, But they weren't the last questions that needed answering. Nolan turned toward the door without another word. Behind him, Chris stayed where he was, watching but saying nothing. There was no need for further conversation. What had been broken couldn't be repaired. Nolan stepped outside, the cool night air hitting him as he walked back to his truck. He felt the lingering ache in his knuckles, the sting of raw skin, but it was distant compared to everything else. He started the engine and pulled away from the lot, leaving Chris behind. His thoughts shifted as he drove. The road stretched ahead, dark and empty, but his mind was already fixed on where he was going next. The conversation with Jenny wasn't over. There was still more that needed to be said, still things that couldn't be left unanswered. He had the facts now, but that wasn't enough. He needed to know why. Nolan returned home just after midnight. The house was dark, save for the faint glow of the porch light casting long shadows across the front steps. He stood there for a moment, inhaling the cool night air, grounding himself before walking inside. His mind was quiet, but not in a peaceful way, more like the eerie stillness before a storm. Every thought, every realization, had settled into something heavy, something that no longer needed questioning. Jenny was already asleep when he entered the bedroom. The soft rise and fall of her breathing filled the space, and for a moment, Nolan just stood there, watching. The same woman who had smiled at him when he walked through the door after years overseas, the same woman who had rested her hand on her stomach and told him they were finally starting a family. She had lied to him. She had let him believe in something that was never real. He moved to the bathroom, shutting the door quietly behind him before turning on the sink. Blood had dried along his knuckles, a reminder of the confrontation with Chris. The cold water stung as he ran his hands under the stream, watching as the water turned pink before swirling down the drain. His reflection stared back at him from the mirror, but he barely recognized the man in front of him. His features were tense, his eyes shadowed, his jaw locked so tight that it ached. He shut the water off and gripped the sides of the sink, inhaling sharply through his nose before stepping back into the bedroom. Lying in bed, he stared at the ceiling, his body still, but his mind unraveling. The pieces of his life no longer fit together. The betrayal wasn't just an event. It was something living, something festering inside of him. It wasn't just about Jenny's lie or Chris's weakness. It was about how everything he had come home to was tainted. His marriage, his family, his future. It had all been a carefully crafted illusion, and now that the truth had been exposed, there was no going back. Jenny stirred beside him, shifting slightly, her hand brushing against his arm in her sleep. The simple, unknowing gesture sent a ripple of something through him, something that twisted deep inside his chest. He didn't move. He didn't react. He just let the silence stretch between them, thick and suffocating. The next morning, Jenny sensed the shift immediately. Nolan was quiet, distant, his movements measured. He sat at the kitchen table, drinking coffee, his gaze fixed on something unseen. When she spoke to him, he answered in clipped sentences, his tone neutral but absent. He wasn't angry. He wasn't upset. But that was what unsettled her the most. She had seen Nolan angry before. She had seen him frustrated, exhausted, defeated. But this was different. She reached for his hand, her fingers brushing against his skin. "Nolan?" she asked, her voice soft, hesitant. He looked up at her then, really looked at her. For a moment, he considered what he would say. The truth? That he knew? That he had gone to Chris, had heard it from his own mouth? That everything she had told him, everything she had built, had crumbled beneath the weight of her lies? Instead, he forced a small smile. "Just tired." Jenny hesitated, searching his face for something. Reassurance, maybe, or an indication that everything was still okay. But all she found was distance. She nodded slowly and pulled her hand away, retreating into small talk, into normalcy. Nolan let her. The day passed in a haze of routine. He worked on small repairs around the house, tasks that should have kept his mind occupied but didn't. Jenny moved around him cautiously, aware of the shift between them but too afraid to press further. Every time she glanced at him, she saw a man she no longer understood. By the time night fell, Nolan's mind was a battlefield. The thoughts, the memories, the weight of betrayal, They circled in his head, relentless and unyielding. But on the surface, he remained calm. He sat on the couch with Jenny, listened as she talked about her day, nodded in the right places, even smiled when appropriate. He played the role she expected, but beneath it all, something inside him was unraveling thread by thread. When they went to bed, Jenny curled against him like she always did, her warmth pressing into his side. He lay still, staring at the darkened ceiling. His breathing was steady, his hands relaxed against the sheets. But inside, there was nothing but fire and ice, rage and silence. He thought of Chris, of his face when he admitted the truth, of the way he had wiped the blood from his mouth and just stood there, accepting it. Nolan had walked away that night, but the anger hadn't left him. It had only grown, simmering beneath the surface, waiting. Jenny sighed in her sleep, shifting slightly, her arm draping over his chest. Nolan didn't move. His eyes remained open, unblinking. The hours stretched long into the night, but he didn't sleep. He couldn't. The next evening, Nolan drove in silence. The hum of the engine was the only sound filling the cab, but his mind was loud, filled with everything that had led to this moment. The betrayal, the lies, the unraveling of everything he had thought was real. The weight of it sat heavy in his chest, pressing down with an unbearable force. He had spent the last 24 hours trying to push it down, trying to pretend that he could move past it, but the anger had only grown. It was no longer something he could control. Chris was at the shop again. The lights inside were on, casting a dim glow through the front windows. Nolan pulled into the lot and killed the engine. He sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. This wasn't going to be like the night before. This wasn't going to end with Nolan walking away. He stepped out of the truck and shut the door behind him. Each footstep felt heavy, deliberate, as he crossed the lot and pushed open the door to the shop. The scent of oil and metal hit him immediately, familiar yet foreign in the context of what was about to happen. Chris looked up from where he was working on a car, his face tensing the moment he saw Nolan. "What are you doing here?" Chris asked, wiping his hands on a rack. There was no fear in his voice, just exhaustion, resignation. Nolan didn't answer right away. He stepped closer, his movements slow, controlled, but inside, everything was boiling. "We need to talk," he finally said, his voice steady despite the storm raging beneath it. Chris sighed and tossed the rag onto the workbench. "I told you everything last night. What else is there to say?" Nolan stared at him, his breathing measured, his fists clenching at his sides. "You destroyed everything. Do you even understand that?" His voice was calm, but the tension in the air was suffocating. Chris exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I never wanted it to happen like this, Nolan." You didn't want it to happen?" Nolan's voice was rising now, his composure slipping. "You didn't want it to happen, but you still did it. You still slept with her. You still let me come home and live a lie." Chris took a step back, holding up his hands. "I know I screwed up, but killing me isn't going to change what happened." The words hit Nolan like a spark to gasoline. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to stop, to walk away, but the anger was too deep, too consuming. Nolan acted without thinking, his emotions overriding reason. Chris barely had time to react. A brief struggle, a sharp inhale, and then nothing. The room fell silent. Tools lay scattered on the floor, undisturbed. Nolan stood still, his breath uneven, the weight of what had just happened settling over him. The realization hit Nolan like a freight train. The weight of what he had done crashed down on him all at once. His heart pounded in his chest, his breathing shallow. He had to leave. He had to get out of there before anyone discovered what had happened. He stumbled back, his eyes still locked on Chris's lifeless form before tearing himself away. He moved quickly, stepping over the scattered tools, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline. Outside, the night was eerily silent. The air felt heavy, pressing against him as he made his way to his truck. He climbed in, gripping the steering wheel as his pulse thundered in his ears. His hands were stained, his mind racing. He needed to think, needed to get as far away from this place as possible. He started the engine, the sound breaking the suffocating silence. He drove, his movements automatic, his mind replaying everything that had led to this moment. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't stay. The town, the streets, the familiar landmarks all blurred together as he disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind the reality of what he had done. Nolan Rogers was apprehended the following morning. Law enforcement was first alerted when an employee at the auto shop discovered Chris's body and immediately contacted authorities. Detectives and forensic teams arrived at the scene within the hour, securing the area and gathering evidence. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses showed Nolan's truck leaving the lot shortly after the estimated time of death, confirming him as the primary suspect. Officers traced Nolan's movements through traffic cameras and witness reports. His truck was spotted heading out of town, taking back roads to avoid main highways. Law enforcement expanded their search perimeter, coordinating efforts between local police and state troopers. Given Nolan's military background, officers were advised to approach with caution, considering the possibility that he was armed and attempting to evade capture. By midday, Nolan's truck was located abandoned near a wooded area outside city limits. Footprints led away from the vehicle, suggesting he had fled on foot. A search team, assisted by tracking dogs, combed the surrounding area. After several hours, Nolan was found several miles from the vehicle, attempting to remain hidden in a thicket. He was taken into custody without incident. Following his arrest, Nolan was transported to the county detention center. Investigators processed evidence, including forensic analysis of the crime scene and Nolan's clothing. His hands had evidences consistent with a physical altercation, further linking him to Chris's death. Authorities confirmed that an official statement and formal charges would follow after further questioning. The trial date was set, and the legal process